both like
Colm doesn't like Brooklyn.
Shoot, you start.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I just came back to Brooklyn after a while away from it. I missed it intensely. And we live in a very sort of industrial part of Brooklyn. It's not particularly pretty, you know, and I grew up in a very pretty place. And I just love it's kind of almost like a scrapyard that we live in now. And something about that is just really pleasing to me. But no, seriously, I just enjoy the atmosphere of the place very much. I think it's very beautiful physically. Not just the scrapyard that I live in, but Brooklyn as a whole, or well, not as a whole, I don't know the whole of Brooklyn, it's an enormous place, obviously. There is a sort of, there is the notion that writers all have to live in Brooklyn now. Colm lives in Manhattan at the moment, he won't join us in Brooklyn.
Not going there, no.
But, my husband and I ended up there because when we came over first to New York, a friend of ours lived in that part of New York, and we stayed with him, and we're too lazy to look for apartments that we couldn't walk to, so that's how we ended up there. But and I wrote almost all of Solace in my apartment in Brooklyn. It's a novel that's set entirely in Ireland, but I think I needed to be away from Ireland to write it, and it turned out that it was Brooklyn that became the place where I was able to tap into those worlds. I don't know why, but I don't think I would have done it anywhere else.
When the woman came to our house in Enniscorthy, and part of the inspiration for Brooklyn was that a visit just of an old woman coming to the house and taking letters out of a handbag and all scarves and all the letters and everything she said. She didn't ever say America, she didn't ever say New York, she kept saying Brooklyn. Her daughter and they're all gone to Brooklyn, they were all in Brooklyn. So the word Brooklyn was in my mind, whatever way she said it. And also, I read an oral history of Brooklyn in the 40s and 50s, and there was just one thing. Often you just need one thing. The one thing was where one Italian was being interviewed, and he said, in those years, every Italian wanted an Irish girlfriend. And I thought, God, if we'd only known that, if that had been widely advertised in Ireland, I think there really would have been a mass exodus in those years. But it was a well-kept secret. But then I understood the reasons why. So then that started to work on my mind. But I knew as little. There's a review of my book by Pete Hamill, who just lists the things that I missed that are not in the book, that are clearly there. And of course they're not there because she didn't see them. And so the less I knew about Brooklyn, the better, because then she was just going to it for the first time, and her entire life in the first year was circumscribed, she just simply went to work and went home and didn't really go anywhere else much. So the less I knew, the better. So yeah, it's Belinda's terrain rather than mine, but I just put it on in my book.
I was curious about your remark about language such as Ithan, that would be natural in Longford. And the novels I've read most recently, I wish I did write, that was for you. The novels that I've read recently that have many times taken place in Scotland or in Northern Ireland, they seem, or in the West Country, they seem to be really rather proud of using their language. My son-in-law is Glaswegian. I have a hard time understanding him sometimes. I think he should come with subtitles. But I'm intrigued with his language. Just the words for face and lips and things like that. And I'm sure the Irish use the same things. I'm wondering why in 2011 or 2012 some of this language, is it that Longford is sterile of it now, or is it that writers writing about upper or middle class people who are successful wouldn't pull it in sociologically?
Just to clarify, do you mean the Irish language, what's called Gaelic?
No, I do not. No,
so you mean colloquialism?
Colloquialisms, yeah, country.
Oh no, I would argue that it's still very much present in contemporary fiction. It just depends where the fiction is set. I mean, if you're going to set a novel in Dublin, it'll be a different kind of colloquialism, depending on which part of Dublin your novel is set in, of course. But I mean, if you look at the work of Kevin Barry, the writer I mentioned earlier, or Claire Keegan, depending on where in Ireland a novel is set, you will find a different that the language is of a different kind. But yes, it has become a little bit more diluted. You know, the other day I was talking to my mother, and she said she used a phrase that I've never heard her use before, and I just sort of raised my eyebrows. She was talking about somebody who was, well, I was, you know, going through, a young man who was going through a hard time, and she said, you know, he's not in a good place. And I said, God, that's really kind of an American phrase, actually.
Yeah, and people talk about closure, for example.
Yeah.
Before it used to be about a door, you know.
I mean, usually, you know, you'd imagine that the phrase would be, oh, he's in an awful state, that fellow, or, you know, he's in right place, or a heap. But she said, no, he's not in a good place. And I just thought, oh, God, I mean, you know, if my mother is talking like this, really.
Yeah, for example, I lived here for a year in 2001, and I think when I came home after a year, one thing had changed, which was, if you went at lunchtime to buy a sandwich, you would go before I left and you would say to the man, can I have a ham sandwich? And a year later you would say to the man, can I get a ham sandwich? And I noticed it because I'd been away. I wondered if everyone was watching Sex in the City or something and just thought that's what you said. But yeah, there is a strange way in which, you know, things are eroding and flavour is moving away. But then it's tremendous fun when you try and meld the two. You know, you try and get someone talking in like a country and western singer, but the country and western place is Irish country and Irish western.
Thank you.
Who? Yeah, sorry.
I found it interesting what you were saying about needing some kind of distance between your personal experiences and what you were writing. I work in the theater where actors use their personal experiences to bring the work to life. And I was taught by Herbert Berghoff that you mustn't use anything too recent because it will make you hysterical. Because you will lose control of what you're doing. I just thought I'd share that with you.
I wonder about that. I think it's a different thing with fiction because you get led places and you often can't control it. It isn't as though you decide to write a novel about a certain subject. You know, that you wake up in the morning and say, I must now make a decision today from thin air to do this. Something occurs to you and stays with you. And it does that for a reason. So it's slightly close to therapy in that sense. A therapist might eventually ask you, why are you telling me this story? And if you're writing fiction, it is because this is what has come to deeply preoccupy me. And it must come from some place within the self that urgently needs this to emerge. And you can't really control that. You really must be able to discipline it and put structure on it. But things come back despite you. You've suddenly found you've written another page without meaning to. And the page has led you somewhere else. And you didn't know that that's where you were going at the beginning or intend it. So it's an odd process. It isn't, oddly enough, like therapy in that it doesn't seem to heal you. It's much more that you're exploiting or using the very things that you should be getting rid of. You're sort of holding on to more. And so that's one of the reasons why I think you wouldn't recommend a writer as a husband or what. I mean, saving your presence things. That people are often difficult because they don't get the thing out, they hold it in. And it's a funny process because it does damage, I think, to the self as you work. I wouldn't recommend it.
No, I can't really add anything.
Can you imagine yourself writing about a place you've never been? The reason why I ask that is because two reasons. One of my favorite writers has written a lot about Japan, but he did not go to Japan until after his first novel was written. And I'm an unpublished writer, and I've written a novel that's set partly in Belfast.
it doesn't work for me personally to do that. I enjoy it, you know, I'm not against the idea per se at all, but for me that would involve too much of the kind of homework that would actually stop me from writing at all. I mean, you know, the research, and I think it would never end, you know, and I work as a journalist as well, and that's where I do my research that never seems to end until the deadline comes into place and you just have to get the piece written. But that's one of the reasons why I prefer to write out of the world of my experience. The other is to do with just that sense of deep immersion, and it's almost a sort of dreamlike immersion, that things show up and you trust them, not because they're necessarily, they may be from personal experience or they may be just a shape or a colour, but it's something that you know at a deep level. I was talking earlier about the idea of not always trusting material when it comes from the place that I've lived for the last few years, which is New York, and maybe that's close to your point about becoming hysterical, because yeah, there are times when I become hysterical with nervousness that this is not going to work out, this next piece that I'm working on. But it might be it might tie into that idea as well of if I have to bury myself in the kind of research that would allow me to envision or to evoke a place I've never been, I feel that I would never really get to the actual act of writing.
I think there's Henry James has a good version of this where he talks about a friend of his who wrote a novel which was much admired at the time, a novel which dealt with the issue, I suppose it was a burning issue at the time, of French Protestant youth. And someone asked her, how do you know so much about French Protestant youth? And she said, oh, I was walking down the stairs and I looked in a room and there were some French Protestant youth in the room. And then I carried on and went down the stairs. But that somehow or other, that was all I knew, but it was quite a lot. And I know this because I remember someone saying to me years ago, I have a novel set in Buenos Aires, and there's a house in the novel that's described in great detail. It's made of glass, that's on the port, and someone said, you must have lived in that. I said, no. And I looked at it. I just looked at it. Whatever it was happened in the gaze. It was enough for me to be able to put it, or want to, or need to put it in a book. So it isn't as though you have to have been in the rooms and know which way the floorboards squeak. There is an element of, at some times in your life, you're so open to images that a single image can come and take full possession of you, and at other times you're not. And that possession, and that taking possession may be in fact that if you saw an image of Japan, just something, that could be enough for you to want to start. So there's no clear, I think, version of this story. It just depends on how open you are on certain days and closed on others.
You both obviously have a really strong Irish identity, and you were born there, but at the same time you have a strong bond with New York. So as writers and throughout the course of your writing careers, which have you found to be more inspirational? You know, just everyday life in Ireland or everyday life in New York?
I don't really notice New York. I'm sure it's nice. And it really looked tremendous. It's very cold. Usually this winter isn't, but usually winters are. And I'm usually indoors a lot. So I could take you through the rented rooms I've had, much more than I could take you through anything else. I think if I was younger, I might be able to tell you about loads of things. But just that now, no, I don't have any feeling for it at all. It doesn't mean anything to me. In the same way, as people talk about it as being all sorts of things, but for me, it's just, I'm usually indoors and I'm usually working and thinking about something. But the idea of its glamour or its allure doesn't really get to me. Maybe I'll have to do something about that. If you know any way of helping me.
We'll get a transplant. As long as the nature or the process or the feeling of the inspiration feels right, then it's equally true of both places for me. As long as I can trust, if you can call it inspiration, as long as I feel that I can trust it and that it's coming, that it's true, then but each place continues to give me ideas for work or settings for work. I've obviously lived in Ireland a lot longer. I came here in 2005 and I go back to Ireland a lot. So a lot of my work is still set there, but I found that I'm writing more and more. And as I say, I'm writing a book that's partly set here now. But it is about how it's less about looking for a place to write about than about what that place gives you and what that act of being given or that experience of being given things by a place feels like. And if it feels right, then I go with it, regardless for...
I think we have time for one more.
Okay, please.
So in your writing process, I was wondering if you guys can elaborate on at what point do you realize that your work is complete?
When the editor says, that's enough procrastination.
I think with the story, with the short story, it's often very difficult because it needs one more image, it needs one more thing. But the one more thing must not bring it any further, must not be an extra thing. It must somehow or other be an image that will sum it up and bring it out, almost like a boat, a little boat would bring a big boat out of a harbour. You need one more thing, one more thing. And it's very hard to get that one more thing. You often have to leave it and leave it. And when you least expect it, you suddenly realise, I know what it is. And just start adding it and adding it and adding it. And often then you could be wrong because it needs one more thing too. But so that you often need to leave things. And also with a novel, you often think you know the end. And you can plan it to go to that moment. And you often need someone else to tell you, that end is so abrupt, it's so strange. You obviously were planning it, weren't you? Yeah. Well, you need something else, just need something else. And that something else is often just that resolving image that doesn't seem to do much, or even just a thing. I remember in one novel, I just couldn't think of what to do. So then I got them back to the house and noticed that, of course, they hadn't been there for a few days. So there was mail in the hall. And she just bent down to pick it up. And then realised, of course, she'd no milk because they'd been away. There was no milk. And then that was almost as much as I needed to get out of the book. But without it, I mean, there was nothing extra in it. It didn't tell you anything about the character or the atmosphere, but just two more images, a thing, get a thing. Is there one more thing? Close your eyes, think. Is there a thing, just a thing? Was someone thirsty and they just went and got the fridge and just poured water into a glass and stood at the window looking out and drank the water? And maybe a word like water will get you out of the story. Often the sound of a word. But you need to be in the right state of mind for that, and you won't always be in it. So if you force it, you'll mess it. But if you let it wait and see and read it over and leave it for the day, and often there's a very big difference between me and I hope I'm not alone in this, in the early morning and late at night. Late at night I tend to be excited about things and think that everything's okay. And then in the morning I'm really suspicious and think everything's awful. And so reading something over in the morning is really good because you think, this is awful.
I finished one novel, and the experience of finishing it was heartening enough to keep me writing another one. When I realised that I was almost at the ending, or I had the ending, or was inside of the ending of Solace, it became almost about its rhythm, about tapping into or realising that I could hear a rhythm. And it happened, I knew I was within sight of the end, I knew I was within 2 weeks of the end. And you get into this sort of state that I've never had a migraine, but you hear that about the aura that you get before getting a migraine. It's almost like that, all your nerve endings are just firing. And you feel, when you read in your excerpt there about Nora having been in touch with the other side, it's almost a feeling like that. I can see it, I can feel it, I don't know what it is yet, but I can see it and I can feel it. And I sat down close to the end and I was writing a scene, and then I realised I need to just do something on this other page, and I wrote the last 3 pages of the novel. Now, I wasn't finished writing the novel yet, but the ending had come, and then I had to go back and write just the scene that would lead up to that. But I knew absolutely certainly that this was the end. And it was almost, the pen was almost being led along the page. It was absolutely extraordinary, and it hasn't happened since, really. You know, and I mean, I really do mean that that's enough to keep me going with the next one, because I want to have that feeling again. And, you know, I could take drugs probably to experience it, but I think I'll just keep writing. And it's just about you start hearing something and you just follow it. If that makes some sense.
There's one more question. We'll just take one more question.
I just happen to notice that you both write a lot about death. Is there a reason why a lot of your books, especially, death seems to come into a lot of your stories?
Oh yeah, a woman in Australia was buying a book and she looked at me and said, "Oh, how many deaths are in this one?" And I looked at it and said, "Oh God, I think it's worse than the previous one." I mean, I don't know what you think, but it seems to me that one of the things that you can deal with in fiction, that say in journalism you don't deal with as much unless you're really specifically being sent on a story to do with death, but that there it is. And if you think about the great books, if you think about something like Portrait of a Lady, I mean the death of Ralph Touchett in Portrait of a Lady is really one of the great scenes, but it isn't something that James really dwelt on in his letters or in anything else much. But I suppose it is one of the things that fiction can do and must do, I think.